First of all, I'd like to say it's a real treat being here and really interesting being in a webinar. It's my first time. Um, I'd like to say just a few words about myself. Some of you know me and some of you don't. My name is Sabrina Gerland, and I've been living in Germany for 30 years. My area of expertise is, business English, like all of us, as well as culture and communication training. Yeah, I'd like to say that before I get into my talk, after having listened to Bao Chuan, he described the different areas of culture and communication training and competence development. The talk that I'll be doing will be concentrating on the intercultural communication action in business settings. Okay, yeah, I'm an intercultural communications trainer, and I live in Germany, so that means I work with Germans. And usually when I do a culture and communication training, I begin the training by asking people, so why are we here? Why is it that you're in the culture and communication training seminar? Why did you book it? And of course, I hear all sorts of things. I hear things that have been named by Bao Chuan. I hear things that are named just now by Evan. But one of the other things that we often hear, or at least I do, is the statement, we need intercultural communication training because they don't understand us. And I've always found that really interesting. I thought, what do you mean they don't understand us? So I start interviewing them and asking them about this, and these are some of the questions that I get. Usually they'll say things like, and of course keeping in mind that I'm working with Germans who are in business communication, or let's say working very intimately with Americans, they'll say things like, well, in a project, how do I get an American to commit? Or how do I tell a client or a colleague that their proposal is not good? Now, when I hear these questions, of course, I still find them rather, how can I say, rather general. So I ask many more questions, and basically what comes out of it is I hear things like, how do I request politely but also clearly? And how can I get Americans to understand that I have made a request? And the next point with the disagreements, or the next question, how do I tell a client their proposal's no good? I hear things like, well, how do I disagree or criticize diplomatically? How can I get commitment when I disagree? And how do I motivate others to agree with my proposal? And I find these things very interesting, mainly because if you look at them, they're all language-based. And if I'm doing a 2-day cultural communication training, it's rather difficult to do any kind of training with these issues here. I mean, I can talk about it, and I can explain to learners, maybe perhaps some of the problems that they're having, but in order to really learn how to do these things, you need more time. And that's why, with my talk, we need to approach these things in the business language classroom, is what I think would be an excellent way to include cultural communication in the language classroom. Let me give you some examples of what I saw, because when I heard these questions and was working through them, I thought, okay, fine, our learners have these difficulties. I'd like to approach them. I'd like to teach these things, but I still need to know exactly what learners are doing with the language. So here we get into the business, the intercultural communication in action in business settings. And these are some examples of some disagreements, because they said that when they disagree with their clients or when they disagree with colleagues, that people don't quite understand them. Well, just to give you an example of the data that I'd collected, some of the ways that they disagreed with the client about an R&D solution. That is, the client said, I'd like to have X, and the speaker, the German working professional, has to disagree with the idea. And they said, well, that's not a good idea. In our experience, that doesn't work. Or, I'm afraid I have to disagree. Or, that's a great idea. I really like it, but it won't work. Okay, those of you who are conversation analysts, you're probably thinking, okay, fine, Sabrina, that's really great, but where's the whole dialogue? I'd like to see where that all fit in there. I'm not looking at the entire dialogue. I just want to look at what they think they know about how to go about disagreeing. And some of the things that I see here is, oh, and by the way, in these situations, the customer made a comment, the client made a comment, made a proposal, and the German working professional then responded. And their responses, the disagreement came at the very, very beginning part of their response. In other words, they uttered the disagreement very directly. So we can see here that in the analysis part of this slide, Research has shown that English speakers tend to avoid explicit acts of disagreeing. So saying I have to disagree is something that probably wouldn't happen very often within Americans if they're disagreeing with somebody. And also, they've also found that when people soften pre-disagreeing acts, they're usually followed by a tentivized act of disagreeing. So if we look at, that's a great idea, I really like it, but it won't work, that breaks that rule right there. In other words, Americans would probably say, that's a great idea, I really like it, but I'm not quite sure how we're going to apply that idea. And that would, of course, geld a disagreement. We can also see in these examples, there's an inappropriate expression of power, mainly because they're all extremely direct. So there's an area here that would need to be worked on in the language classroom. We need to realize that our learners may not always have very let's say, diversified knowledge about how to go about disagreeing, especially if they're Germans, and in German culture, let's say politeness culture, very direct disagreement in many cases is considered polite. If we take a look at the next slide, here's an example of a request. So in this situation here, the one colleague, the speaker, is requesting data from another colleague. It's a woman who wrote an email, and she requested in this way. Now, she needed data for a presentation that she's putting together. And she wrote, I would kindly ask you to spend a few minutes of your worthy time to help me on some information for our big project, which has to start next month. If we take a look at the analysis here, we could see that this request here would probably be seen as something cynical. First of all, I ask you is considered a command or an order. I mean, it's a request. We can see that. But at the same time, it carries another tone. It carries also the tone of an order or command. And I would kindly ask you to send me the data would be cynical, because she said I would kindly ask. You can see that it's over-the-top politeness, which can, in some situations, come across as being very rude. The same thing with the worthy time. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, did something happen before that? Because if I read this out of context, I would think perhaps something happened previously in which the woman, the German working professional who's asking for the data, asked before, it didn't come, and she asked again, and it still didn't come, and she realizes that the person she's asking is being lazy, perhaps, is not really actually following through. But actually, none of this happened. This was a situation in which she was asking for the very first time. So we can see here is there's another element that should be looked at with the kind of English that our learners are using, especially when they become advanced level such as this, because when you look at this example on a grammatical basis, it's perfect. Okay. The next one I'm not going to read to you, but basically it's a request to help to entertain visitors. In other words, one colleague, the German, is asking an American colleague if he could stand in and take some visitors who are coming to the company and show them around, because something's come up and he's not able to do the job. And if you take a look at this without actually reading it, it's rather long, it's detailed, and it's confusing. The first part of the utterance, basically the person is explaining the situation, the background. And the underlined part here, I would have to look for someone to replace me, is the actual request itself. The thing is that the person who's listening to this will have to listen almost 2 minutes before they actually hear the request. That can be rather confusing. It can be boring. It could also happen that the person doesn't understand it, because if you look at the first part, it's not all that well structured either. Another thing that's interesting is you'll see the major challenge, and the word major is used quite often. From a German point of view, to animate somebody else or to motivate them to follow through or to help you out with something, by pointing out how difficult it is or how big the problem is a way to show that I'm not imposing on you because I think it's okay. The point is, it's confusing. And if we take these things and we refer back to the title of my talk, which is we need intercultural communication training because they don't understand us, we could say in this particular situation, yeah, they might actually miss the request. And in the other situations, like the previous request and the disagreement, probably they're really well understood as requests, as disagreements. But what's not understood is that they were meant to be polite. They were meant to be considered appropriate. And this is what at least the learners that I'm working with, what they think is appropriate for these particular situations.